What happens when an avoidant realizes they were wrong? Avoidance creates a particular kind of blindness. Proposital blindness. They can watch relationships fall apart, see the pattern repeat, witness the hurt in others' eyes, and still find ways to reframe it as the other person's problem. This disconnect between what's happening and what they tell themselves about what's happening can last for years. Today, you'll discover what happens when an avoidant realizes they were wrong, the internal experience of their walls cracking, how they confront what they've been running from, and why understanding this process changes everything about how you see avoidant behavior. If you recognize yourself in these patterns, whether you're the one who runs or you've been left by someone who does, leave a comment telling your situation. People with avoidant patterns look at their relationship history and see a string of failed connections, but the meaning they assign to these failures protects them from the actual truth. They were incompatible with every person. Those people were too needy, too emotional, too demanding. The relationships were suffocating. They needed space, and those people couldn't give it to them. Each ending feels justified, and this narrative shields them from ever having to consider that maybe they're the one doing something that keeps pushing people away. What makes avoidance so persistent is that it actually works, for a while. These people do avoid pain. They do stay in control. They do protect themselves from getting too close. The cost is loneliness, shallow connections, and a persistent sense of disconnection even when surrounded by others. But for someone whose brain learned that closeness is risky, this trade-off feels reasonable. The problem is that humans need real connection. You can run from intimacy for years, maybe decades, but eventually something shifts. Sometimes the realization comes gradually. Someone might notice they're older than they thought they'd be and still single. They watch friends building families and real partnerships while they cycle through surface-level relationships. They notice they're using the same excuses about the current person that they used about the last 5 people. A quiet thought starts forming. Not loud, just this whisper they keep trying to ignore. They notice they feel empty in a way that doesn't go away. Other times, it comes suddenly. Someone might lose a connection they actually cared about more than they expected. The relationship ends not because of incompatibility, but because the other person finally got tired of trying. They see that person moving forward with someone else, and it hits different this time. Or someone says something so direct, so honest, that their whole explanation system just stops working. They hear themselves described, their pattern laid out clearly, and they can't unsee it. What hits first is grief, not the initial shock of a breakup, but the deeper grief of recognizing something about themselves. They start noticing things they've been blocking out. A conversation where someone told them they felt abandoned, and they just shut it down instead of listening. A breakup that happened because someone wanted more intimacy, and instead of trying, they decided they were incompatible. Times they got scared and disappeared. Times they went cold when someone needed warmth. Times they just ran. This is where it gets real painful because it's not abstract anymore. It's specific. It's that particular person and the way they looked when they pulled away. It's words that got said and words that didn't. It's time that got wasted. The realization hits. The defense mechanism wasn't protecting them from anything real. It was protecting them from having to be vulnerable, from having to grow, from having to risk getting hurt by actually showing up. Inside during this moment is something pretty chaotic. 2 things that don't make sense together are both true at the same time. There's someone who values independence and protecting themselves, and they're also someone who used that protection to never actually connect. They're someone who tells themselves they're fine alone, and they're also genuinely lonely. They're someone who said all those relationships weren't right. And they're also someone who might have sabotaged them because real intimacy terrified them. Looking back at their history with fresh eyes changes everything. Relationships that seemed to fail because of incompatibility now look like they failed because distance was created at crucial moments. Connections that felt too intense now look like they were just becoming deeper, and that scared them. People they wrote off as needy now look like they were just asking for normal emotional presence. The realization hits. They've been building their own isolation. And that means they can't blame circumstances anymore. They have to sit with the fact that they might be the one who's been wrong. This usually hits with shame. Not guilt about specific actions, but shame about who they've actually been. They think about people they hurt with coldness. They think about connections they destroyed by running. They think about chances for real closeness that they sabotaged because vulnerability felt dangerous. Some sit in that shame for a while. Some try to escape it by going back into old patterns, creating distance again, finding new reasons why people aren't right for them. But something's changed. The old excuses don't work anymore. Once you see the pattern, you can't unsee it. What often happens next is a sudden urge to reach out to people from the past, to explain, to somehow fix what happened. Sometimes this is actually the beginning of real connection, recognizing that someone mattered. But sometimes it's just another way of avoiding. It's trying to undo the past instead of actually changing behavior. It's looking for quick forgiveness so they can feel okay. Again, instead of doing the hard work. The difference is whether they're reaching out to genuinely take responsibility or hoping someone will make them feel better. Real transformation includes understanding that they can't fix what's already done. They can't make people unhurt. They can't restore relationships that are over. What they can do is change how they show up going forward. But that requires something incredibly hard. Staying present when things get uncomfortable. Feeling emotions instead of shutting down. Actually talking about problems instead of leaving. Letting someone see the real them, not just the protected version. When someone stops just feeling bad and starts looking at why they do this, things shift. They begin to see that their brain learned a certain way of protecting itself. That logic might have made sense at some point. The nervous system got trained to believe that closeness is dangerous and built walls to keep safe. In adult relationships, situations where they could actually be safe, they're still operating from that old training. They're acting like connection equals getting hurt. Understanding why doesn't immediately fix everything, but it creates something important: compassion. They can start to see themselves with gentleness instead of just judgment. They recognize they weren't being intentionally mean. They were doing what their nervous system thought it needed to do to stay safe. This doesn't erase the damage caused, but it makes change feel possible instead of impossible. What happens when someone realizes they were wrong is that they face an actual choice. They can go back into the patterns because they're familiar, and they kind of work, even though they're lonely. Or they can sit with the discomfort of actually changing and start learning to be present, to communicate, to be vulnerable, even though it's terrifying. Some choose to go back into denial. They tell themselves that moment of clarity was just weakness, and they return to their old stories. Others decide to actually do something different. Those who commit to change might find a therapist who gets attachment stuff. They start noticing when they want to create distance, and instead of doing it, they pause and feel what's underneath. They practice staying present when things are uncomfortable instead of leaving. They start telling people how they feel instead of shutting down. They let people know them instead of keeping everything at arm's length. It's slow, hard work. Teaching the nervous system that vulnerability isn't the same as danger takes time. But here's the thing that most people don't talk about. The hardest part isn't the realization itself. It's what comes after. It's the daily choice to stay when every fiber of their being is screaming to run. It's sitting in conversations that make them want to disappear. It's feeling emotions they've spent years avoiding. It's being present with another person when being alone feels so much safer. This is where most people who have that moment of clarity actually fall apart. They see the problem, they feel terrible about it, and then they realize that fixing it is going to require them to do something they've never done before. Actually stay uncomfortable. The discomfort is different from what they expected. They thought the hard part would be admitting they were wrong. It turns out that's actually the easy part. Admitting it to themselves. Saying it out loud. That's uncomfortable, but it's quick. What's actually brutal is waking up the next day and having to live differently. It's having the urge to escape and not escaping. It's having a conversation go badly and resisting the impulse to leave. It's getting criticized and not shutting down. It's feeling rejected and not creating distance to protect themselves. It's moment after moment after moment of choosing to stay when staying feels dangerous. A lot of people who realize they were wrong try to shortcut this part. They think that understanding why they do something is enough. They think that feeling bad about it will motivate them to change. They think they can have the realization and then quickly move back to normal. But there is no shortcut. The nervous system that learned to run can't unlearn it through insight alone. It has to be rewired through experience. The body has to learn that presence is safe by experiencing presence over and over and over again. That takes time. That takes consistency. That takes showing up, even when it feels wrong. What makes this phase so hard is that old urges still show up. Someone might be having a real, vulnerable conversation with their partner and suddenly feel that familiar panic rising. The impulse to leave gets loud. The voice that says, "This is too much. This is too close. This person is going to hurt them." That voice doesn't just disappear because they had a realization. It still shows up, and they have to feel it. They have to let that panic exist in their body and choose to stay anyway. They have to let their nervous system panic while they do the opposite of what it's telling them to do. That's genuinely hard. A lot of people also underestimate how many times they'll have to make this choice. It's not a one-time decision. It's not even 10 times. It's hundreds of times. Thousands of times. It's every time the old pattern wants to kick in. It's every time they feel triggered. It's every time they feel like the walls are calling them back. Someone who's genuinely changing their attachment patterns has to choose presence over absence constantly. They have to recognize the urge to run and choose to stay. They have to recognize the desire to shut down and choose to feel. They have to recognize the impulse to create distance and choose to move closer, over and over and over. The reason people stay in this difficult phase is because something starts to shift with all that repetition. The nervous system gets evidence that contradicts what it learned to believe. They stay present in a difficult conversation, and the person doesn't leave them. They express a vulnerable feeling, and they don't get rejected. They let someone see them, and they don't get hurt. These experiences don't change things overnight, but they accumulate. The nervous system slowly starts to believe that maybe closeness isn't as dangerous as it thought. Maybe presence is possible. Maybe people who care about them won't abandon them if they show their real self. But this phase also involves a lot of failure. Someone might do really well for weeks, and then something triggers them and they slip back into old patterns. They create distance. They shut down. They pull away. And instead of that being the end of the story, it becomes an opportunity to practice again. They recognize what happened. They talk about it. They try again. The difference between someone who actually changes and someone who doesn't is that the person who changes treats these failures as data, not defeat. Each time they slip and then catch themselves and come back, they're rewiring their brain a little bit more. What's also true is that staying with discomfort requires support. Some people try to do this alone, and they burn out. They're fighting their nervous system without help. They're trying to rewrite neural pathways through willpower alone. That's exhausting. Most people who successfully move through this phase have a therapist. They have a partner who understands what's happening and doesn't give up. They have friends who get it. They have some kind of structure or community that holds them accountable. They're not white-knuckling through it by themselves. They're getting help. Another thing that helps is self-compassion during this phase. People often realize they were wrong, and then they're incredibly hard on themselves about it. They're angry at themselves for the years they wasted. They're ashamed of the people they hurt. They're frustrated with how slow the change is happening. But that self-criticism actually works against change. The nervous system that learned to protect itself through shame isn't going to become safer by being shamed more. What actually helps is treating themselves the way they're learning to treat their relationships, with presence, patience, and compassion. When they mess up, they acknowledge it without judgment and try again. When they struggle, they get support, instead of pushing harder. When they slip back into old patterns, they notice it with curiosity instead of anger. The reality is that someone who genuinely realizes they were wrong enters into a long process of learning to do something their nervous system was trained to believe was dangerous. Every day they're basically swimming against the current of their own conditioning. And every day they do it anyway. That's where real change happens. Not in the moment of realization, but in all the moments after, when they choose to stay even though staying is hard. The process isn't quick and it's not straight. There are moments when old patterns resurface. The urge to run comes back. The panic about getting close shows up again. But now they can see those urges as part of the pattern instead of proof that the relationship is wrong. They notice the impulse to run and choose to stay anyway. They feel the panic and work through it instead of using it as a reason to leave. Every time they make that choice, they're slowly rewiring their brain to understand that staying is possible and safe. People around them start noticing things changing. They show up differently. They're actually present in conversations instead of mentally gone. They respond to what people are feeling instead of dismissing it. They ask questions because they actually want to know. They acknowledge their own feelings instead of pretending they don't exist. They say sorry when they hurt people instead of defending themselves. They stay in hard conversations instead of walking away. They let people see them. The realization usually brings grief about wasted time. Understanding that years were spent in isolation that didn't need to happen. Connections that could have developed got blocked by their patterns. Relationships that could have gotten deeper got ended early. People who cared got pushed away. Time that could have been spent building real closeness got spent running from it. This grief is actually important because it's part of what motivates real change. The regret is real, and it's supposed to be. But there's also something else that shows up. Hope. For the first time in a long time, someone who's actually seeing what's happening understands that the future doesn't have to look like the past. They don't have to keep doing the same thing over and over. They don't have to keep ending relationships before anyone can hurt them. They don't have to keep running. They can actually try to build something real. They can actually stay. They can actually let someone know who they really are. The walls that kept them safe from pain also kept them away from joy. That trade wasn't worth it. They can do something different. What happens when someone realizes they were wrong is ultimately this. They wake up. They see their own behavior and what it's done to other people and to themselves. They see that their defense mechanism was working against them, not for them. They see that their loneliness was at least partly something they created, not just something that happened to them. That waking up is disorienting and painful and uncomfortable. And it's also where real connection becomes possible. It's where they can actually stay instead of run. It's where they can be truly known. If you recognize yourself in these patterns, whether you're the one who runs or you've been left by someone who does, leave a comment telling your situation. Like this video and subscribe for more content about attachment patterns and relationship dynamics. Thanks for watching.